fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass.
When you think about humans in outer space, I bet the first image that comes to mind is Neil Armstrong taking those famous first steps on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I mean, that's always been the case for me, which makes sense. That moment was a big deal, no doubt about it. But it was just one moment from one mission. The Apollo program lasted 11 years, launched 17 missions, and produced tens of thousands of photographs.
There was more than just one mission. That more than Neil Armstrong isn't the only man that's walked on the moon. So that is partly an objective of the book, is to go through every mission.
Andy Saunders is a photographer who created a best-selling book called Apollo Remastered. It's a collection of hundreds of remastered photographs taken by astronauts from the Apollo missions. The film for these photos had been sitting in a vault in Texas for nearly 50 years, and technically, they were public domain and free to use, something that will come up later in another episode. But because of the sheer amount of time it would take to restore these photos, no one had really done it until Andy came along. Up to that point, almost every picture we'd seen from outer space had been a low-quality duplicate.
And it just hit me that to me, the most important photographs ever taken are actually getting progressively worse as time goes on, whilst being seen by a progressively bigger audience. And that concept I could not accept.
So he developed a process to restore these photos and put them into a book. Apollo Remastered was a big hit. After it came out in 2022, Andy toured the world for a series of live exhibits and recently produced his follow-up book, Gemini and Mercury Remastered. But this isn't just a book. It's a photographic journey and a visual legacy that allows us to see the moon and outer space the same way astronauts saw it all those years ago. My name is Stuart, and this is Crew Collective, a podcast about storytelling. Each episode, we'll explore stories that help shape us. Books, movies, songs, nothing is off limits. We'll talk to creators about their process, their craft, and the worlds they build. In Season 1, we're exploring space stories, so that's where Apollo Remastered fits in, and my conversation with the guy who created it is next.
Crew Collective is brought to you by Rocket Genius, makers of Gravity Forms. Gravity Forms was the first premium WordPress contact form plugin launched in the space over 15 years ago. Since then, brands like Delta, Christie's, and Thermo Fisher have relied on Gravity Forms for their WordPress form data needs. But so have tens of thousands of freelancers, agencies, and small creators, powering payment forms to newsletter signups. For small and large alike, Gravity Forms understands their mission: build amazing software that people trust. Learn more at gravity.com.
And now, my conversation with Andy Saunders, photographer and author of the book Apollo Remastered.
I just always had an obsession since childhood about the Apollo moon landings. I was just obsessed with anything that could fly. But then rockets, I always felt, were kind of the ultimate flying machine. And then in terms of the moon, I remember looking at the moon through just a little toy telescope. Again, I was very young and being just fascinated with this place and how, looking through a telescope, what's this we usually see as a two-dimensional silver disc in the sky suddenly became three-dimensional. So it became a world that you could potentially go and visit in a rocket. And as a child, that was obviously very exciting. So I've always had that kind of childlike fascination with the Apollo moon landings. Always had this interest and love for photography. And so working on these images was a way to kind of unite those two passions. But it really started with, I was very conscious that something very important was missing because I wanted to see Neil Armstrong on the moon, and I couldn't. And we've never been able to because he held the one and only camera they took onto the lunar surface. You remember, this is an analog world. It seems insane that we could go to the moon and not take a photograph of the first man on the moon. But it was an analog world, so they only took one camera. And that always frustrated me. I wanted to see Neil Armstrong on the moon. So that's when I decided to look at the other source of film that was taken, which was this 16mm noisy, lower quality motion picture camera, a bit like an old cine film camera, which was pointing out to the lunar module, and it filmed the EVA. And then that's when I decided to apply this quite unusual stacking technique that's used in astrophotography on that film to produce that image that I always felt was missing from the history books. And now we have it, the first clear, recognisable image of Neil Armstrong and the moon. So that's what got me kind of known for doing it. That's where I built a lot of the skills and an interest. But also around that time was when the holy grail of film became available, when NASA, everything we've seen today has actually been based on duplicate film, because the original film was too delicate, too valuable. So that was held in a frozen vault in Houston, Building 8, Johnson Space Center. So everything we've seen in terms of the imagery from Apollo has been based on duplicates or copies of duplicates or an internegative to create a photograph. And you have this gradual degradation in the quality of the imagery. And that's something else that always frustrated me. You know, they actually took the best cameras, the best lenses. Film photography captures, you know, all of the detail that we can with digital photography. We should be seeing these images better. So when that film came out of the freezer and I was able to work on the raw scans and able to transform these images, that's then when I fully became what I do now, which is digitally restoring photographs, particularly from this era.
Getting the film is one thing. Making it presentable? That's another ordeal unto itself. Like Andy was saying, the film degrades over time, so he had to get innovative to restore these images to their former glory.
These are super high resolution, high bit depth scans, so everything that was in that original film is captured in these scans. And what I do with that isn't particularly innovative. I use kind of standard digital processing techniques to kind of stretch the contrast and pull out the detail. The difficulty with it is once you've pushed the digital processing this hard, is you get all kinds of artifacts on the film. So you can tell there's something amazing in it, but it's not worthy of being shown. And so the trick there is just to spend the time and the efforts to balance the whole frame, to get the colour correct, to pull all that detail out and have something that's the best it can be. So that really is more taking the time and the effort to do it. The more innovative approach, yes, is this stacking technique. So this is something that, say, is used in astrophotography. It's quite a difficult thing to explain, but if you think of it in an analog world, so if you imagine you've taken some, let's call it cinefilm, some cinefilm footage at, say, 12 frames a second, and if you imagine that film, it's semi-transparent and you can kind of see through it. If you then were to cut, let's say, 10 of those frames with a pair of scissors, if the image that's on it doesn't move too much, and you can perfectly align that image and stack those 10 frames on top of each other, squish them together, and look through it, you can probably imagine that the signal, which is the image, gets stronger. But the noise doesn't get stronger because the noise is completely random. It's in a random place on every frame. So what you do by squishing these together and consolidating these frames is you strengthen the signal, but you average out the noise. So you basically improve the signal to noise ratio. The more frames you have, the better the averaging. So if anyone's really into the nerdy detail, the improvement in the signal to noise ratio is the equivalent to the square root of the number of frames. So if we have 9 frames where the action doesn't move too much, we get 3 times the improvement in the signal to noise ratio. So it becomes that much clearer, more photo-like, and we can pull out detail we've never been able to see before. Now, the difficulty with that, so this stacking technique, like I say, it's used in astrophotography, it's used in, I think, in the medical profession and that kind of thing. So it is a known technique. The difficulty is, so when I did the image of Neil Armstrong, the camera was locked off and Armstrong was getting a contingency sample. So his gold visor was up because he was in the shadow of the lunar module. And because he's working on this sample, he stays still for some time. And that enabled me to lift pretty identical frames and stack them easily. When I started to do the book and I wanted to assess all of the 16mm film from the whole of the Apollo program, I realised that actually most of it was filmed handheld by, an amateur photographer who's floating around in zero G, and he's trying to film someone else that's also floating around in zero G. And so because of all that movement, it's difficult to align and stack in the normal way. So that's where then I developed a technique to continue to stack, but also still take account of all this movement. But in doing that, because they often panned the camera, so anyone that's seen the book, there's a chapter on every mission. Apollo 13 was always a particular interest of mine, and here was an opportunity because it was all filmed on board this tiny spacecraft. I always wanted to step on board that spacecraft and take around and have a look around. Anyone that's seen the movie, the Apollo 13 movie, if you're anything like me, I always get to the end and think, what was it really like? What did it really look like? And because Jim Lovell, even though they didn't know they'd get back alive and didn't know if they'd ever get that film processed and developed, he had the presence of mind to continue to shoot these sequences. Because he panned the camera, that has enabled me with this new technique to be able to not only stack, but create like a panoramic shot inside these spacecraft, for example, inside Aquarius, this lifeboat that got them home.
I can see the picture right now without opening the book, the picture of the three of them in that module, in that lifeboat, as you call it. And they don't know whether they're going to survive this mission or not. But the idea that they had the presence of mind for the sake of posterity, it's just an amazing story, and it's just incredible that it's captured and been restored.
Okay, that sounds good.
We're considering powering down the pings, but we want to know what capability you have to do a course and final line. And we read your conversation about being unable to see out the window very good. How about out the AOT?
Yeah, that particular shot, that was with the 16mm film, and I think it was Fred Hayes had the camera at that moment, and he just panned it towards themselves and captured, because he sweeps past all of them. I was able to get all three of them on. So yeah, to see the whole crew together as they were preparing to, I think it was just before they were moved into the command module from memory, to then separate and hopefully get home. And Fred Hayes mentioned when they went back into that command module, it's been turned off in effect almost completely for days in that environment, and they had to power back up all the systems. They didn't know if that was going to work because the temperatures, he said, it was the control panels were just full of condensation.
Okay, and the other thing we thought you might try is to put the service module between you and the sun, and then to see if you can see anything out the window in that attitude.
That mission it was just event after event after event that had to go right to get them home alive. And that image of the three of them was, I think, close to the last that they filmed. And then they entered that command module, and at that point then they just hoped that the parachute system would work, the recovery system. Because at that point they didn't know for sure if the heat shield had been damaged. So, yeah, to get them home alive was, as Gene Kranz say, perhaps NASA's finest hour.
The Apollo missions are probably the most famous of all NASA missions. And of those, we probably know the most about Apollo 11. And of course for good reason. That was the moon landing. The first one anyway. But Andy's book gives all the other missions their due credit as well. Case in point, Apollo 8 in 1968 produced a photo known as Earthrise. You've probably seen it. As the crew was orbiting the moon, astronaut Bill Anders snapped a picture of the Earth rising above the horizon. After witnessing that, his crewmate Jim Lovell described Earth as a grand oasis in the big vastness of space.
It took a while for that image to become as prominent as we see it now. You know, perhaps one of the most famous photographs ever taken, certainly one of the most influential. You know, we think of the environmental movement. This was a catalyst for the environmental movement that continues to today. So very important image. And it really was a bit of a team effort. What's incredible, and again, that some people may not realise, is that wasn't taken on the first time that Earth was rose from the lunar surface. The first couple of orbits, they didn't even notice it because, it depends on where the windows are orientated. And they hadn't planned to witness Earth rise and photograph it. You know, this was a scientific mission. They had a lot of other things to do and to focus on, and testing the spacecraft and photographing the surface, looking for cues and for landing sites for the Apollo 11 mission. So it just wasn't at the forefront of their mind. And it was only on the third orbit, and it was a reason connected to photography, actually, that Bill Anders turned the spacecraft to face the windows towards the lunar surface. And that's what suddenly brought the Earth into view out of the window as it was rising above the lunar surface. And Bill Anders spotted it. And just hearing this in the audio, or if you read it in the mission transcripts, is great, because he gets really excited. He just like, wow, look at that. And then he obviously wants to get a photograph, but he only has a black and white magazine on the back of the camera. So again, contrary to popular belief, that Earthrise isn't actually the first photograph of Earthrise. He did take a black and white photograph first, because that was what was on the back of the camera. That is in the book as well, and it's an absolutely stunning photograph. It is in black and white, but it's an absolutely stunning photograph, and he was just desperate to get this on a colour back. And that's where he asks the crew to, get me a colour magazine. I think it was Jim Lovell that eventually found the colour magazine, got that to Anders, he got that on the back of the camera, and then he got the colour photograph that he was after, and that photograph that we all know so well. So it was a very much a team effort. Borman turned the spacecraft that allowed it to come into view. Anders spotted it and happened to be holding the camera. Lovell found the colour film, and between them they got that shot.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, that's pretty. Hey, I'll take that. It's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color, quick. Oh man, that's great. Quick.
I think that brings up what's one of the more fascinating elements of this whole story, which is that these were not professionally trained photographers. And I understand that on the Gemini missions early on, that before they were using these Hasselblad cameras, which we can talk about in a minute, didn't someone just kind of snag like a really cheap camera at a pharmacy or something and take that up there with them? Because like you said, photography was kind of an afterthought. Especially the first time we send someone to orbit the Earth, we're just kind of like, well, really, we hope he doesn't die. That's objective A. so pictures were just kind of an afterthought. So yeah, what do you know about that trajectory, that kind of evolution of using the Hasselblad cameras, and also a little bit about, did they begin incorporating some photography into their training as these missions became more sophisticated?
Yeah, you're right. So it was John Glenn, the first American to orbit Earth, on his mission. Well, let's take one step back. The first American in space, Alan Shepard, on his flight, he had a camera that was mounted in a little porthole window, and it automatically took photographs every 6 seconds. NASA wasn't keen for an astronaut in those early days to be messing around with a camera. They were busy enough. Like you say, the primary goal is get them into space and get them home alive. They were very short missions. They were in these tiny capsules. So to play around with a camera and to take the attention away from mission critical events, NASA weren't very keen. But when John Glenn went on his mission, he said, well, no, I need to share this with people. People are going to want to know what it's like to be an astronaut. They're going to want to see this view of Earth. We're going to see things no human has seen before. I want to take a camera. He went for a haircut in near the Cape somewhere, and on his way back, he spotted this camera in a drugstore, $40 camera, and it was one of the first auto exposure cameras on the market. And he just thought, oh, well, that's perfect, because I won't need to play around with settings so much. So he bought it and convinced NASA that to allow him to take that on his mission. It was adapted. They made like a pistol grip, because with the gloves and the helmet, it's difficult to point a camera, hold a camera. So he took the first handheld photographs of Earth from space. That's all coming up in the next book. So the next book is the prequel to Apollo Remastered. This is Gemini and Mercury Remastered. So I go into all of this, and all these photographs are in there. But he basically took the first photographs of Earth from space with that camera. So from then, all the astronauts were keen to take a camera. And it was Wally Shearer on his Mercury flight. So this is back in 1962 that wanted to take a really good camera. He sought the advice of professional photographers he knew from like Life magazine, for example, who all suggested that the Hasselblad 500C would be a great camera. This is a medium format camera, bigger film. You could change the magazine so you could have different types of film for kind of more photographic scientific experiments. You can change the lens. So this was an ideal candidate, and it had to be adapted to be taken into space. That was really the start of this relationship that continued right through actually to the space shuttle era of NASA's relationship with the Swedish manufacturer Hasselblad to develop these cameras that ultimately ended up on the moon. But yeah, it was really, photography became just, the objective was to document the mission for technical assessment back on the ground. So it's kind of, they just inherently captured images that transcend documentation, because you think of the subject matter is just inherently stunning. What they were doing was incredible. These suits they were wearing, the spacecraft, the backdrop was literally otherworldly. So they didn't take photographs for their aesthetic quality. Like I said, they took them for technical assessment, but they happened to capture those incredible images. And it was on Gemini 4, which was Ed White when he performed the first spacewalk, the first US spacewalk, to then see a human form in space. So these incredible photographs of him floating, the blackness of sky, Earth below. That's when there was a huge public reaction to those. And NASA thought, oh, actually, this gets people really on board with the space program. We need continued congressional support, financial support. And that's when they realized actually that the public affairs side of space photography became a bit more of a thing, as did photography in general. And so it's really from that moment that NASA put more finances into developing the equipment, the astronauts, yes, better training and more training. So they actually did become great photographers, because if you think they took, on each magazine there was around 200 photographs, and you can argue that per unit of weight, just one little wafer thin piece of film has a huge scientific return based on that weight. And so because weight and space are so restrictive on a mission, especially to the moon, they worked hard to get as many frames in a magazine as possible and take as many photographs as possible. So that side of things developed, the number of photographs that you get in a magazine developed, and the cameras developed, because you need a different camera to work on the moon than you would need to work inside a capsule.
These are very, very candid shots that they're taking on the moon for a lot of the reasons you just said. Some of it was for scientific observation, so NASA could get a better sense of what they were doing, what they were seeing. And my understanding from what you wrote in the book was that they were trained to take photographs of things as they saw them, rather than doing these very kind of posed pictures that maybe we would become accustomed to in today's age of like Instagram, where everything feels very, very posed, very, very inauthentic.
Yeah, the astronauts became very keen. Some were more keen than others to do the training. Some, by the time they got to the mission, they told me they were just absolutely fed up of taking photographs, because they were driven to do it, because this is it's a finite resource. As I say, the scientific return per photograph, every one is so valuable. And of course, we think today in the digital world, when we go back to the moon on Artemis, we can take an infinite number of photographs. Here, they had to be very selective, and so they had to be trained very well to use the cameras. They also didn't have, for example, a viewfinder. There was no automated features on the camera. The only automation was when they got onto the moon, they used a Hasselblad 500 EL, which had an electric motor, which meant that when they took a photograph, it would wind the film for them. I mean, that was about as, automated as they got. So they had to set the exposure themselves, the focus themselves, and because of the tight confines of the spacecraft, and because of the helmet and the suit, the type of viewfinder you had on these older cameras that popped up on the top of the camera, that you would have to look down, you typically hold them at your waist and look down to see through the lens. Well, you can't do that in a spacesuit. So they got rid of that. So a lot of that training was to be able to capture what they wanted to capture, but without having a viewfinder. Also to get the exposures correct, to get the focus correct. So that's why they had to train particularly hard. And yes, they'd take them on vacation. They'd take them in the T-38 training jets. They would take them on these geological field trips, and they would take photographs, have them critiqued, go again, take photographs until they got so expert that when they're in that environment, in that vital moments when they're on the moon, the chances of them taking a photograph that's of scientific value is that much higher. And they were brilliant at it. So I went through, they took 35,000 photographs were taken throughout the whole program. Not all of those were handheld on the lunar surface, but thousands and thousands and thousands of handheld photographs. And the vast, like 99 point something % were right on the money. They were correctly focused. Exposure was pretty good. And they captured what they intended to capture. Didn't need to do much rotating, cropping, and that kind of thing. So they clearly did. That training clearly worked very well. The other thing that makes it a little bit easier, if you think about it, taking photographs in space, is that they don't have a variable of weather. There are no clouds in space. It's either a known brightness when you're not in the shade, or a known light level when you are in the shade. So that was a benefit. So again, as you got throughout the mission, they could learn from the previous mission. So by the time we got to Apollo 17, I mean, the photographs there, that needs a book all on its own. I mean, the photographs there are absolutely stunning. And interestingly, that is probably you mentioned earlier about, they wouldn't do post photographs. That is the only mission, other than a little bit on Apollo 12. On Apollo 17, they really made an effort to try and capture themselves and, for example, the Earth above them. So there was a little element, not for many photographs, but for a few. And I think that was partly, they took so many magazines of film. It was the last mission for what we didn't know then, over 50 years. So I think that's why they did start to take a few kind of staged photographs.
Yeah, and somebody had the presence of mind on the way back to get one more picture of the moon as they were headed back towards Earth. And I think it's one of the last photos you have in the book with the caption, "Goodbye Moon," not knowing, again, it would be more than 50 years before anybody returned.
Yeah, that was on the Deep Space EVA. So again, because of the photography, they had to actually exit the spacecraft and go and collect these film magazines, these huge film cans that were stored in the service module. So as well as the handheld photographs, they also had this camera with huge resolution, 127mm film that was in the service module. So that was controlled by the command module pilot, who can open a hatch, start the sequence of photographs, but then they would have to exit the spacecraft, which is very risky, to go and simply collect that film. And whilst he was out, they took these photographs of this incredible point where they looked one way and there's the distant moon, and then they look the opposite direction and there's the distant Earth, which must have been pretty spectacular.
During Apollo 17, which was NASA's final mission to the moon to this point, there's a picture that's equal parts beautiful and eerie, for lack of a better word. It's this lunar module, kind of a base camp for the 3 astronauts on the mission, and it's sitting off on the moon's surface in the distance. Astronauts Gene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Harry Schmitt were out exploring the moon in a rover and looked back to see their only connection to civilization, nearly 230,000 miles from Earth. And from that vantage point, it looked tiny.
That was actually a photograph that I first saw in a book in the 90s called Full Moon, and I was obsessed with it. I mean, I just like that. It just hits you, not just the scale and the grandeur of the moon, but when you see how far away they were from the relative safety, this little home they had, this tiny spacecraft that delivered them to the surface, it just really, really resonated. So when I was now able to get at the original flight film, I really wanted to do the best I possibly could with this image. And what I've actually done is created a panorama, because we took more than one photograph. So I wanted more of that landscape. So this is actually 2 photographs stitched together to get even more of that grandeur and scale. I think it's the South Massive is beyond the lunar module, and the East Massive, I think, is beyond that. So these are these mountains in the Taurus Littrow Valley where they landed, and there's this tiny spacecraft sitting on the lunar surface, just under 2 miles away. And it is an absolutely stunning photograph. And that was taken with a 500mm lens, so a very large telephoto lens, which itself had quite an interesting story because it was on Apollo 15, which was the first J mission. So this is one of the first big scientific missions. They landed in the Hadley-Pennine region, which is photogenically is an absolutely stunning region to land, and of great scientific interest. But a lot of what they wanted to look at, for example, the mountains, were of course a long way away. And even though this was the first J mission, and so they had the first rover and could get a lot further than they could on previous missions, they wanted to get even closer. And the easiest way to do that is to have a longer lens on the camera. So Leo Silva, who was the geologist, but particularly the crew, and in particular Dave Scott, who was the commander, really pushed hard to take this 500mm huge lens on that mission. But NASA said, no, it's just too big and it's too heavy. So, we think trying to squeeze every last little piece of film because of the weight in these magazines to then take, and the number of cameras and magazines they were already taking. And this lens is like a foot long, weighs 2 kilograms. And in the end, he said, okay, well, take some abort fuel off me. And in the end, that was the compromise they made. They said, so they took the equivalent to the mass of the lens away from his abort fuel, and he took the lens and it made it on that mission and took some fantastic photographs from a scientific point of view. They could get a lot of information from those. And so it also went on Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, and it's with that lens that took this particularly stunning photograph.
I mean, we see this from the perspective of the photographer, of the lens. I'm trying to imagine being out. And what is that out there? Is that like a little rover, what is that out there that we're seeing in the distance exactly?
That's the lunar module. So that
the lunar module. So who was in the lunar module? Do we know?
Nobody.
Nobody was in it.
So they left the lunar module in the lunar rover, and they went off to these different geological stations, and they drove. Actually, on Apollo 17, they got to 4.7 miles away from there. So they slept in the lunar module. That's the other thing I love about seeing these photographs. That's their home. They slept in there for 3 nights. So that
little speck, the only remnant of civilization at all is that tiny little thing against that. That has got to be surreal to look at that. And I mean, it's got to be. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of confidence that this is the 17th mission. Of course, there is still a whole team, but there's got to be something pretty humbling about. That's home right now. That's
their and only relative safety, compared to the spacesuits. So they'd sleep there for 3 nights. They'd get up in the morning, and their day at work was they would get their gear on and step out onto the moon, into the lunar rover, and drive around and do this geological sampling and go up slopes and to the edges of. There's another stunning shot in the book, which is a 3-page gatefold. So the book has these pages which fold out. So they're like a meter wide, and it's a panoramic sweep of a crater on Apollo 17. And we can see the lunar module, and we can see Jack Schmitt, who took this photograph. And just to see the grandeur and scale of the lunar landscape. So they go around and see these incredible things. And that was their day at work. And then they returned to that lunar module, and they'd set up the hammocks and they'd sleep. And another great photograph, again, on Apollo 17 that's in the book. It's one of the last photographs taken on the lunar surface back in 1972 is of the commander, Gene Cernan. And you can see the suits piled up on the ascent engine cover. And he's just in his kind of undergarment, and you can see his kind of biomed sensors. He's filthy. He's got moon dust all over his face. He looks exhausted. And that's a fantastic documentary type shot of the last man on the moon in this little tin can, he even described it. So that's what went on inside that lunar module. That was their home for 3 days. This was taken from, as I say, about 2 miles away. And yes, they had to have confidence in the rover to get that far. So, and the confidence, yes, developed from mission to mission. On Apollo 11, the furthest they got from the lunar module was about 200 feet, because they didn't have a rover, and of course it was the first mission and they had to build up the confidence in what they were doing. They got further and further, and then with the rover, they could then push that envelope even further, and like I say, to 4.7 miles, which was what was considered the safe walk back limit. So if that rover failed, they reckoned that they could, between them, walk home 4.7 miles, which sounds quite an extraordinary thing to do and a bit of a risky thing to do, but that was considered the edge of the envelope.
Apollo Remastered is chock full of stunning imagery, but not every photo in the book is mind-blowing, at least not at first glance. During Apollo 11, before Armstrong took his famous one small step, he snapped a picture off to the side of their spacecraft, and it looks kind of uninspiring, until you realize it's the first photograph ever taken on another world.
The background to some of the photographs that come before or after perhaps a particularly famous image, are all vital parts of the storytelling of the mission of what they were achieving. So some of the photographs in the book aren't very aesthetically pleasing, but they're of historical significance. Some of them are there because something happened that is fundamental, like I say, to tell the story. We have images like the Blue Marble, which is the most reproduced photograph in history. I mean, we've seen it everywhere that was taken on Apollo 17 of Earth amongst the blackness of space. But, what were the astronauts saying at the time? What photographs were taken just before it? What does it mean when we think about the fact that you may see that photograph, just going back to the Blue Marble for a moment, and we've seen it in textbooks, we see it on cereal packets, T-shirts, and you may think, oh, look, there's the whole Earth, that's a nice photograph, and just get on with your day. But I think when you really look at it, like I say, what were the astronauts, what was going on? Why was that photograph taken? There were 3 men inside a tiny capsule travelling at 20,000 miles an hour away from their home planet on a trajectory that wouldn't ordinarily get them home, and one of them lifted the camera to the window, released the shutter, and took that photograph of the whole Earth amongst the endless blackness of space. I think having a human behind the lens and thinking about that context is what makes those photographs even more special. So this one on Apollo 11, isn't a particularly stunning photograph. In fact, it isn't a stunning photograph, but it's the first photograph one of us has taken on another world. So it's of that significance. It actually shouldn't really have taken that photograph at that point. That wasn't in the mission plan. The mission plan called for, so he'd come down the ladder, one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, of course, and then he stepped off. Didn't want to move too far from the lunar module. No one's walked on the moon before. Is he going to sink? Is he going to fall? Is he, and on his checklist, it does say, get the camera down from the lunar module. And they had to do that. They didn't have it on the chest when they came down the ladder. They had something called the Lunar Equipment Conveyor, or the LEC. Basically some rope, really, on a conveyor that they could then, Buzz Aldrin could attach the camera to it, and Neil Armstrong could pull the camera down, attach it to his chest, and start taking photographs. But the mission plan called for the first thing he should have done is take a contingency sample. So this was in case something of an emergency that happened, he would get one small sample in his pocket so that at least the geologist would have a sample of the moon, or even, albeit a very small sample. But he got the camera down on the LEC and he put it on his chest. And when it was on his chest, I think he just thought, well, it's on my chest, let's take some photographs right now. And that was the very first. And actually, this was the first of a sequence. So he did a panoramic sequence. The astronauts, particularly on the latter missions, actually, were trained to take a photograph, turn 20 degrees, take a photograph, turn 20 degrees, take a photograph, to create these panoramic sequences. And this is what Armstrong, this is the first thing he did on the moon, was to take this sequence of photographs, of which this is the very first.
What's the reaction to that? Does he get like a dressing down from mission control or anything, or did they just kind of let it slide?
No, I mean, the mission was going so well. And I think when you got the first 2 people on the moon,
You'd have to be a real stick in the mud.
It's quite difficult to then be a bit of a stick in the mud about the precise order of things. But you can hear and read in the transcripts is Mission Control internally are saying, has he got the contingency sample? No, I don't think so. And they decide not to mention it for that reason. They also don't want to kind of fluster the astronauts. They know their job. Things were going well. But yeah, they were really keen to get this contingency sample. And in the end, they did say, Neil, have you got the contingency sample? And he said, and that was the next thing you did. I'm working on it now. And actually, as he was creating that, collecting that contingency sample, as I mentioned at the start, that's when, thankfully, he lifted his visor and he stood still long enough that I was able to use the 16mm film that was pointing out of the window of the lunar module to get that image of him, that clear image, finally, after 50 years of the first man on the moon.
One of the other reasons why I chose this picture in particular to discuss with you is that I think in the caption somewhere, aside from making that executive decision about the order in which he was going to do things, he also forfeited a rest period, I think, right? Like, wasn't it kind of worked into his schedule, I guess, that he could get, for lack of a better word, a nap? But there's this like very human thing. I just landed on the moon. I'm not taking a nap. And I guess like it shows this very human side. Like we think Neil Armstrong, superhuman astronaut. But I mean, I think he had to be pretty giddy. He's up there on the moon. I mean, he had to understand the significance of what he was doing. But also just this very, I think, like childlike wonder of like, I'm not taking a nap. Are you kidding me? Like,
it was just really bad planning, wasn't it? to land on the moon and then factor in a rest period. Yeah. It was kind of an optional 4-hour rest period. Again, they've got to make sure the astronauts are focused and ready to complete the mission. And so, given what they'd been through with the landing, I think it was considered that, well, let's have that 4-hour rest period as an option. And they had an incredibly long day, very stressful time landing on the moon. But as you say, they then landed and they said, we're going to take this 4-hour rest period. They are feet away from the lunar surface, the first people to walk on the moon. They could see the lunar surface out of the window. There's the hatch right next to them. Let's depressurize, get our suits on and get out. And so the decision was, how could you possibly have a nap? You land on the moon and become the first to walk on the moon and just have it. I'd like to think he made the right decision.
Big picture stuff, like why does it matter to the average person, to someone who's maybe never thought about reading a book like Apollo Remastered before? Why is it important that we all get to see outer space?
I might be biased, but I think a lot of people would agree that walking on the moon is probably our greatest ever achievement. The photographs that were taken of this pivotal moment when we humans were able to leave our home planet for the first time and walk on another world. And the photographs will forever symbolise and document the beginning of humanity's expansion out into the universe. We'll eventually, yes, we walked on the moon, we'll eventually walk on Mars, we will eventually become a multiplanetary species, but this is where it all began. It was Richard Underwood, who's NASA's chief of photography, who made the point to the astronauts before they went that, look, when you get back, you'll be a national hero. And maybe in decades, there may be some really nerdy teenager that wants to go through all the data and all of the documentation. But really, it's the photographs are kind of the starting point forever of referring back to going to the moon. So if you get great photographs, they'll live forever. And I think he was right. Earthrise, the Blue Marble, Buzz Aldrin, Man on the Moon. It's the photographs that I think we naturally turn to, and they will forever, I think, document and symbolise what is a pivotal moment in human evolution. Like I say, photographs for 50 years were based on this duplicate film, and they were just the way they presented just drove me nuts, because they were also getting progressively worse. So you had all this copying of duplicate film back in the analog days, and then in the digital world, it got worse because it's so easy to put a JPEG on the internet. Someone will copy it and save it again and put it back on and crop it and rotate. And it just hit me that to me, the most important photographs ever taken are actually getting progressively worse as time goes on, whilst being seen by a progressively bigger audience. And that concept I could not accept that. And so to finally have the holy grail of film, this original film, out of the freezer. So this is the film that was actually in the cameras on the moon. So we can think of negative film. It wasn't actually negative film. It was the colour photographs. The image resided on that very film that was in the camera in a colour correct positive form. So to have that film that was literally exposed in this alien environment finally out of this freezer and scanned to an incredibly high resolution, to go back to the source for the first time and be able to see these photographs in a way you've never been able to see before, that is what compelled me to, when I see a bad image, it's tantamount to someone writing about Apollo 11 and misquoting Armstrong's One Small Step speech. I mean, it just shouldn't happen. They are too important not to be seen correctly and at the best, which is why then I decided to, once this film came out the freezer, I put my life on hold, and 10,000 hours of digital processing later and a lot of research, we finally able to see the Apollo missions in this way.
If there's one photo in Apollo Remastered, one we haven't discussed yet, is there one that you'd recommend?
Gosh, that's an almost impossible question. Like I said, they took 35,000, narrowing it down to 400 for the book, which is unusual. I mean, it's a huge number for a book, 400 photographs, and it was almost impossible. So to then narrow that down to one, and I like different photographs for different reasons. There are these historically important ones, such as the only clear image of Neil Armstrong on the moon. But probably if I was really, really pressed, I mean, the front cover, and it's probably obvious to say, it made the front cover, it had a bit of everything. So this was a photograph that was unbelievably underexposed. So when I was going through these 35,000 photographs, I'm looking for anything that gives me a clue that there might be something interesting in it that's worth the 1.3 gigabyte file download and spending time to look into it. But there was a little glint of a window. So I thought, well, there might be something. If I can see a window, there might be a person in it. And I could see a little purple square in the corner of the window, which I knew was the guidance site. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at that. And then when I started to stretch the contrast and look at what was in this, I thought, oh, wow, there's a person in this, and this could be a fantastic photograph. But again, it is so underexposed. When you push the processing this hard, I had all these artifacts on it. It just was not presentable. But it was clearly going to be a stunning image. So that front cover took me about 2 days working on it to get it right. And we end up, it's a portrait of the Commander Jim McDivitt on Apollo 9. It looks like he's looking up in wonder through the window, but in fact the reality is even better. So in researching all his photographs, I spoke to Rusty Schweikart, who actually took that photograph, and he said, I can't tell you how hard Jim is focusing in this moment, because as it turns out, he is actually undertaking the docking, not any old docking, the first ever docking between two crewed spacecraft. So an incredibly high pressure moment. This was the first time we had people in a spacecraft that was incapable of getting them home, because they were in the lunar module that has no heat shield, and they were in Earth orbit. So Apollo 9 didn't go to the moon. They were just testing the lunar module and the command module. So the heat shield was on the command module that he was trying to dock to. So if he didn't make the docking, and it's never been done before, they are not getting home. He also had to translate all the movement through 90 degrees in his head, because the controls were set up to land on the moon to look forwards out of the lunar module window, but he was looking up, performing the docking. So Rusty Schweikart said he tried to get the, inverted commas, software adapted to do this for him before the flight, but NASA said, we've not got time for that. Don't worry, Jim will be fine. So Jim had to translate all these movements through 90 degrees in his head. He had to dock, if not, they weren't getting home, and it's never been done before, and this is the moment it's happening. So this photograph for me had a bit of everything. It's one we've almost never seen because it was in such a bad state. The lighting is stunning, and we have this portrait of the commander undertaking this first docking. So that photograph for me is probably one that's got a little bit of everything in it.
A passage from Apollo Remastered recommends reading the book alone at night when everything is real quiet. A special thanks to Andy Saunders for joining us on this episode of Crew Collective. To learn more about his work, check out apolloremastered.com, and while you're there, check out his new book, Gemini and Mercury Remastered. Same concept, different missions. Also, all of that and more is linked below. Crew Collective is brought to you by Rocket Genius. Our executive producers are Matt Medeiros and Travis Tots. This episode was written, edited, and produced by me. I'm Stuart Barefoot. More episodes are available at crewcollectivepodcast.com or anywhere else you might get podcasts. Next time on Crew Collective.
And I'd read a couple of space books. And my main question at the time had been like, how does it feel to leave everything behind? Like, do they miss Earth? Do they miss their family? It's a real commitment to go on a long journey. So yeah, my idea for Terra 2 kind of came from a mixture of those inspirations.